so much for joining me today. We are starting our winter Sunday school series this week, and we're going to be taking a look at Ezekiel and Daniel over the next 13 weeks. And this week we're going to start off with Ezekiel, and we're going to look at the first 3 chapters. Our curriculum zeroes in on part of chapter 3, but we're going to do a little bit broader look today because I think it'll help us get a good foundation as we start this study. So let's go ahead and pray as we get started. Oh God, we thank you so much for today. We thank you for the opportunity to open your word together. I pray that as we read your word, God, that you will speak to our hearts and that you will just teach us something today. We love you, Jesus, and we pray all of this in your holy and precious name. Amen. So as I said, we're going to be taking a look at Ezekiel 1 through 3 today. And don't worry, we're not going to read all of it. We're going to walk our way through it. And we'll read some different sections that will help us to establish the background for this book of prophecy. So Ezekiel, I have to say, Ezekiel is one of my favorite prophets to read about. God has him do some crazy stuff, and I don't know that we're going to get to read all of those things since we were splitting this study with Daniel, but I highly encourage you to read through this whole book because God has Ezekiel do some crazy things. Lots of different actions that he has him take to as part of the message that he's sending the people. So I hope you will join me in reading through this very interesting book this winter. So we're going to kick things off here with the first chapter, and I'm going to read part of it, and then we're going to talk about it because we need to find out who is Ezekiel and kind of set our background. So I'm going to read the first 3 verses of chapter 1. In my 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kebar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. And the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, the priest, the son of Buzi, by the Kebar River, in the land of the Babylonians. There the hand of the Lord was on him. So we learn a lot in these first 3 verses. One, we learn that where Ezekiel is. He is by the Kebar River, and this is in the land of the Babylonians, which it's something that I've never really stood out to me before, but I was kind of blown away by that this week as I was thinking and reading and working through these opening chapters, was that Ezekiel was in exile. He wasn't in Jerusalem. He was in exile. And so he was taken as part of the first wave of people deported to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. So King Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem a couple times. And the first time he attacked Jerusalem was in 597 BC, and he attacked Jerusalem and it fell, and he took the first wave of people to Babylon, and so this is when Ezekiel went. He took a lot of the wealthy people, the ruling people, lots of different people who would have been a part of the more noble class. And it says, if you wanted to read that story, you can look at 2 Kings 24. It does a good job of giving us an overview of what was going on at the time. And so he takes this first wave of people. And so Ezekiel is part of this first wave of people who are sent into exile. Now, the city of Jerusalem will not completely fall to Babylon until 587, so 10 years later. But this first wave is where our story starts here in Ezekiel. And when we look at, as far as the overall structure of the book of Ezekiel and the message that God gives him, we'll see that pattern. So we see here, it says in the 5th of the month, in the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. So this is about 5 years into this first wave of deportation. And he's going to be speaking to the exiles there. And the first part of the book, if we're thinking about the structure, we have Ezekiel's call and vision, which is what this first vision that we're going to talk about today in chapters 1 through 3. Then beginning in chapter 4, going through about chapter 24, we have his message to the exiles before the final fall of Jerusalem in 587. Then we have kind of an interlude section in chapters 25 through 32, which concerns messages about other nations. And then picking up in chapter 33 and continuing on through 48, we have messages of hope that are that happen after the final fall of Jerusalem in 587. And so these first messages that we're going to start reading next week are going to be a lot more judgment focused. And then the ones after the fall of Jerusalem are a lot more hope focused. And so I think it's kind of an interesting structure. So that the book of Ezekiel is laid out very chronologically. And he gives us some dates, like we saw here in these first 3 verses. He gives us dates that we can be able to place this book in the historical context. And we don't always get that whenever we're reading it, especially reading through the prophets. We get references, but we don't necessarily get specific dates. But Ezekiel gives us quite a few dates. And for the most part, they're laid out chronologically. So he structures this book very, it's very ordered and it's very precise in the way that he puts it together. And so it's very interesting. And it's different than some of the other prophets that we've read. So back to these first 3 verses. So we learn where he was and kind of situated in the right place in history. And then we learn a little bit about him. He says Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi. So Ezekiel was from a priestly line. So the line of priests. And most scholars are saying that he had yet to be old enough to start carrying out his priestly duties. That would have happened when he was around the age of 30. And most scholars will say in the first verse, it says in my 30th year. So this vision is coming to him and starting off when he is around 30 years old, which would put him being born in the time of King Josiah, which is very interesting because it would have put him born during a lot of the reforms that King Josiah was doing to bring about proper worship of God. And so he would have grown up under that and then seen the kings after Josiah fall completely away and everything just go very poorly and people stop worshiping God and all of those things. And so he is, but he is a priest. He was trained as a priest, and we can see this way of thinking where he thinks like a priest. It shows up in the way that he speaks and the way he acts and thinks. And so I think that's something that's very interesting as I was studying and thinking about this whole book, to think about who Ezekiel was and how that impacted him and like how this call from God is going to impact him, because he's going to be called to be a prophet, which is very different than the calling to be a priest. If you were to think about those 2 different things, and you can imagine that was quite a shock. So right about the time that he was supposed to be beginning his priestly duties, he finds himself in exile, far away from the temple where he was to serve, and receiving this call from God to be a prophet. So let's look at this vision. So it happens, that's the next thing that happens in Ezekiel 1, is Ezekiel has this vision of a windstorm, and it comes and he realizes as it gets closer that it's not just a normal storm, that it's a vision. And he sees these beings, these living creatures that appeared like human, but they had 4 faces and 4 wings, and there were these wheels, and it's very interesting. And I encourage you to read through this vision. It starts in verse 4 and continues on to the end of chapter 1. We're only going to read part of it. And I want us to read the description of God, because I think that is something that's very interesting. Okay, so we are going to read Ezekiel 1, starting in verse 22 and reading through the end of chapter 1. Spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked something like a vault, sparkling like crystal and awesome. Under the vault, their wings were stretched out, one toward the other, and each had 2 wings covering its body. When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings, like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. When they stood still, they lowered their wings. Then there came a voice from above the vault over their heads as they stood with lowered wings. Above the vault, over their heads, was what looked like a throne of lapis lazuli, and high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal as if full of fire, and that from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord, and when I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking. What a very, a beautiful picture, and a very interesting one. I love how Ezekiel describes God and describes this throne that God is riding on. These living creatures are carrying this throne across the plain towards him. And it's so interesting. And I can't imagine trying to describe seeing the glory of God. And in a lot of ways, we see Ezekiel being at a loss for words. And I love this description of the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, and thinking about just the radiance that is, that God would radiate all of the colors in the world. And that's just beautiful and very vivid. Such a vivid image here. But I think one of the things that's so important to draw out here, and as cool as this description is, one of the things I think that is particularly striking, though, is that God is appearing to Ezekiel outside of Jerusalem. And to think about this is that God would dwell in the temple in Jerusalem. That was God's dwelling place, in that most holy of holies, and how he would dwell there and be there with his people. And here now, Ezekiel is not in Jerusalem. He is in the land of the Babylonians, as we learned in those first 3 verses. And here God has shown up. And shown up in the midst of this exile, in the midst of these people who are really struggling with what they are going through. They are completely broken. They've been sent away from their homeland and probably wondering, like, where is God? Did our God get defeated by the Babylonians? But yet here God is, and he shows up in a most unexpected place on this throne that is transportable. And it's almost as if he's saying, my authority, my sovereignty is over all, and it's not limited to any one place. I can be everywhere. God is present everywhere. We can find him wherever we are in the world. He's not limited to one geographical location. And I love that picture here. And I love that that happens here for Ezekiel. And then God is going to speak, and he is going to call Ezekiel to be his prophet. And that's what happens in chapter 2. He calls him the Son of Man. That is a title that he refers to Ezekiel throughout this whole book. He'll call him the Son of Man. And really that's just saying, hey, human being. That's another way you could translate it. Stand up on your feet and I'll speak to you. So he has him, remember Ezekiel was kneeling, now he has him stand up and he speaks to him. And he says, I'm sending you to the Israelites, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their ancestors have been in revolt against me to this very day. And that was at verse 2, verse 3. And he says, the people to whom I am sending you are obstinate and stubborn. And he wants Ezekiel to say to them, whether they listen or fail to listen, that they will know that a prophet has been among them. And he's saying, you're going to go and speak to these people, to the people there with you that you're living among. And you're going to go and speak to them, and you're going to bring my message. And he describes Israel as very rebellious and stubborn. And if you look through that whole passage, the word rebellious or rebel turns up quite a bit. That is the way that the people of Israel are depicted throughout this first section. And God talks about how they are going to not listen. You have to speak my words to them, whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are rebellious. And he says, you need to speak my words and not rebel like these rebellious people. That's in verse 8 of chapter 2. And so God is saying, you're going to be my prophet. I'm going to call you to speak for me to these people who are in exile with you. You are the people that you are among. And it's very interesting because he is a prophet who is being called to his own people. And that is very true of prophets. They are sent to their own people usually, and which makes the rejection probably all the more worse, because it's people that they know and people that they should expect to know the truth. And so that's what God is calling Ezekiel to do. And so we're going to pick up here in chapter 3, and we're going to read part of our section for today that our curriculum focuses on. So at the beginning of chapter 3, God gives Ezekiel this scroll, and he tells him to eat it and then go and speak to the people of Israel. And so Ezekiel eats it, and he says that it tasted as sweet as honey in his mouth. So the word of the Lord tasted sweet like honey, even though it was going to be a message of judgment to a people who had rebelled. And so then God says in verse 4, he says, Son of man, go, 3 verse 4, Son of man, go now to the people of Israel and speak my words to them. You are not being sent to a people of obscure speech and strange language, but to the people of Israel. Not to many peoples of obscure speech and strange language, whose words you cannot understand. Surely if I had sent you to them, they would have listened to you. He says, but the people of Israel are not willing to listen to you because they are not willing to listen to me. For all the Israelites are hardened and obstinate. But I will make you as unyielding and hardened as they are. I will make your forehead like the hardest stone, harder than flint. Do not be afraid of them or terrified by them, though they are a rebellious people. So God's telling him, hey, this is going to be hard. The people are not going to want to hear what you have to say. And you're going to have to be tougher than they are. You're going to have to be stronger than they are and be more stubborn in the sense of being stubbornly focused on what it is that I am telling you to say. I don't know about you, but this so far doesn't sound like a very positive thing that you're going to get to go and do if you're Ezekiel. I would be feeling a little bit, oh my goodness, what is God calling me to do? What have I gotten myself into? And so we get a little bit of Ezekiel's response. He doesn't really say anything in response to God. He doesn't ask questions or say much, which is interesting because when we think about some of the other prophets, we get a verbal response. Like with Isaiah or with Moses, we have this verbal back and forth with God trying to understand this. But God says, go to these people and do what I say. And then the Spirit takes him, starting in verse 12, and so in verse 14, it says, the Spirit then lifted me up and took me away, and I went in bitterness and in the anger of my spirit with the strong hand of the Lord on me. I came to the exiles who lived at Tel Aviv near the Kebar River, and there, where they were living, I sat among them for 7 days, deeply distressed. So we see Ezekiel's response of just being completely distressed. It says bitterness and anger of spirit. And his response to what God is calling him to do is to just be kind of depressed about it and maybe a little frustrated. It's very different than what he would have been called to do as a priest. So a priest, he would have been called to serve in the temple and to be kind of that go-between between the people and God. And the focus would have been on holiness and being clean and holy versus what was unclean. And here God is saying, hey, you're going to be a prophet and you're going to speak for me. And Ezekiel would have had experience seeing Jeremiah. He was younger than Jeremiah, but would have been what was a younger contemporary of him. So he would have been familiar with him and what God had Jeremiah do. And I can imagine him going, oh my, this is going to be maybe not so fun. And so he sits and he's distressed about it. But we know from the rest of this book that he does take up that call and he does follow what God tells him to do. And God's going to pick up and say a little bit more about that. And we're going to read from verses 16 through 21 in chapter 3. And that's going to be our last section that we talk about today. At the end of 7 days, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the people of Israel. So hear the word I speak and give them warning from me. When I say to a wicked person, you will surely die, and you do not warn them or speak out to dissuade them from their evil ways in order to save their life, that wicked person will die for their sin, and I will hold you accountable for their blood. But if you do warn the wicked person, and they do not turn from their wickedness or from their evil ways, they will die for their sin, but you will have saved yourself. Again, when a righteous person turns from their righteousness and does evil, and I put a stumbling block before them, they will die. Since you did not warn them, they will die for their sin. The righteous things that person did will not be remembered, and I will hold you accountable for their blood. But if you do warn the righteous person not to sin, and they do not sin, they will surely live because they took warning, and you will have saved yourself. So God is giving Ezekiel instructions to be a watchman. And a watchman, if you were to think about what a watchman would do, especially when you think about cities with these huge walls, a watchman's job would have been to be up on a tower and to be watching all across the land that they could see and be watching for any sign of the approaching enemy or of any type of trouble so that they could then be able to sound the alarm. And the people in the city or the army or whoever was supposed to be able to respond would be able to respond and be ready so they could close the city gates, so the army could be ready to respond to an approaching enemy. Whatever it was, the watchman's job was to sound the alarm. And if the watchman did their job correctly, then the people would be able to have time to respond and they would not be held responsible for anything, for the people's failure. But if the watchman didn't, then there would be some sort of responsibility for any loss of life on that watchman. And so we see here that God is saying, hey, Ezekiel, your job is going to be this watchman, to proclaim this message that I'm giving you. And you are responsible for the message and for proclaiming it rightly in the way that I have asked you to. But you're not responsible for how the people respond. So Ezekiel is supposed to tell the people there's judgment coming. God's judgment is coming. And it's interesting because he says that you're supposed to warn the people. A warning from me. It could be a warning of, what is this enemy? Who or what is the enemy? Well, it's God's judgment. So it's very interesting because God, the one who is going to judge these rebellious people, is also the one who is asking Ezekiel to be the watchman. He's setting a watchman, even though he's judging these people for their rebellion. I think that is it's such a reversal. The approaching enemy doesn't say, hey, you need to go put a watchman on the tower. God is saying, hey, we need to set a watchman because the people need to know. And I think this tells us a lot about who God is. That the approach of the consequence for the rebellion is real. And it's not some fake thing. But God's ultimate desire is that people will repent and that they will turn back to him, turn their hearts back to him. And he wants them to be able to have the opportunity to hear that message. So in these first few chapters of Ezekiel, what does this have to do with us today? I was thinking about that because Ezekiel was definitely preaching to a very specific group of people in a very specific point in history. But this call and this call of God for Ezekiel to be a watchman, I think is something that we should really listen to. That God, we as followers of Jesus, we too are commissioned to share a message, to proclaim the message of the good news of Jesus, what he came to do for us, his life, his death, his resurrection, and how he transforms us. That is the message that we're to proclaim to the world around us. And we too are supposed to proclaim that message. And I think that that's something that we can really hang our hats on, that we aren't necessarily responsible for how the people respond to it, but we are responsible for faithfully sharing the message that God has given us, the good news of Jesus, of what we have seen and heard. The other thing I think that we can take from this first section is that God can show up anywhere. God showed up in the unexpected. He showed up somewhere that they would never have thought. In the midst of the land of the Babylonians. God was supposed to be in the temple in Jerusalem, but he showed up and he reminded them, hey, I'm still at work. I still have things to do and I can still meet you even here. I can meet you anywhere. And that's pretty cool. I think that's a very important promise to remember. So I hope you're as excited as I am to dig into this book and to see what God has to teach us. I think there's a lot of things that we could hear and learn from and just really, there's a lot of interesting things in this book. And I hope you'll take this journey with me and read it throughout this whole first like 6 or 7 weeks of the study. All right, I'll see you next week. Bye.